In the Indian federal system, state legislatures are elected to pass laws that reflect the immediate will of the voting public. But those legislative mandates frequently hit a wall. Unelected governors receive these passed bills and deliberately take no action, leaving them piling up indefinitely. In constitutional law, this deliberate inaction is known as the pocket veto. Politically, it creates a severe imbalance. A single appointed representative of the central government can effectively paralyze state-level governance by simply refusing a piece of paper. This indefinite stalling mechanism creates a structural friction in the federal system. It is an administrative roadblock that ultimately required a definitive legal intervention. That intervention arrived at the Supreme Court of India. Hearing the case of the state of Tamil Nadu versus the governor of Tamil Nadu, the bench examined this specific deadlock. The court delivered a clear ruling. The Constitution does not grant governors the power to exercise an absolute veto, nor does it allow for a pocket veto. To enforce this, the court mapped out strict, mathematically binding timelines that govern both the actions of state governors and the President of India. By establishing these deadlines, the executive veto transitions from an ambiguous political weapon into a highly regulated, predictable administrative process. To see how the court constrained this power, we have to start with Article 200 of the Constitution, the legal gateway every state bill must pass through to become law. Upon receiving a bill, the governor originally had 4 explicit pathways: grant assent, withhold assent, return a non-money bill for reconsideration, or reserve the bill for the president. An important overarching limitation applies here.
The governor has almost no independent discretion. They must act on the aid and advice of the State Council of Ministers. There is one major exception to that rule. If a bill specifically threatens the powers of the High Court, the governor is not bound by the Council's advice. The Constitution clearly defined these pathways. However, it failed to mandate a specific speed limit for deciding which path to take, and that omission allowed the pocket veto to thrive. Article 200 uses the phrase "as soon as possible" regarding the governor's decision time. The Supreme Court took this vague language and weaponized it, establishing rigid, legally enforceable deadlines. This document outlines the Supreme Court timelines. The top row shows a strict 1-month baseline constraint for withholding assent or reserving a bill. Moving down, if a governor acts contrary to the State Council of Ministers, they have exactly 3 months to do so. If the governor misses these deadlines, their inaction loses all constitutional protection and becomes immediately subject to judicial review. As soon as possible is no longer a gentle suggestion. It is a legal boundary that state executives cross at their own peril. The court also addressed the third pathway, returning a bill for reconsideration. This historically led to stalemates when a state legislature refused to back down. If the assembly stands its ground and repasses the returned bill, whether they include modifications or ignore them, the bill lands back on the governor's desk.
Looking at the bottom row of the court's timeline matrix, we see the rule for this exact scenario. For bills reenacted by the assembly in this second round, the governor is legally compelled to grant assent within 1 month. A governor cannot repeatedly stonewall a determined legislature. Once a bill is successfully repassed, the executive is stripped of veto power and forced into compliance. This leaves the fourth and final pathway under Article 200, when a governor chooses to reserve a bill for the president's consideration, governed by Article 201. Historically, Article 201 contained a massive flaw. Because the Constitution provided 0 time limits for the federal executive's decision, presidents effectively held an absolute veto through perpetual delay. This graphic breaks down the mechanics of presidential assent for state bills. The middle column highlights the core issue: no time limit for the president to act, allowing indefinite retention. The right column shows that previous commissions recommended prescribing a precise timeline to fix this. The Supreme Court realized that tightening the governor's deadlines would be entirely useless if the president could simply continue the exact same pocket veto at the federal level. To close this loophole, the court applied a new constraint. The president is now legally required to make a decision on a reserved state bill within 3 months. Furthermore, they cannot reject a bill in silence. If the president chooses to withhold assent, they are mandated to formally declare their reasons and communicate them back to the state government. So what happens if the president breaches this 3-month limit? The court provided the states with an enforcement mechanism. States are now legally entitled to file a writ of mandamus against the president. a court order compelling a government official to fulfill their official duties. The president's absolute, unquestionable veto has been dismantled. It is now a system of accountable, compelled action, complete with an enforcement mechanism. Looking at the entire legislative pipeline from the State House to the president, we now see a synchronized system governed by strict countdowns. Beyond imposing clocks, the court introduced a broader directive to prevent these legal clashes from happening in the first place, rooted in cooperative federalism. States are now required to engage in pre-legislation consultation. Before introducing highly contentious bills that might trigger a veto, state governments must engage the center in dialogue. In return, the central government has a reciprocal obligation to review these state proposals with due regard and expediency. The judicial mandate attempts to force proactive political dialogue and compromise, systematically closing the avenues for silent obstruction. The state of Tamil Nadu versus the governor of Tamil Nadu ruling directly re-engineered the balance of power between elected assemblies and appointed executives. By legally quantifying the vague phrase "as soon as possible," the Supreme Court has insulated the legislative sovereignty of elected state governments against the threat of